Welcome to one of the most exciting chapters of this video course, Hyperlapse photography. Now, hyperlapse photography is a niche within time-lapse photography, and it is often described as a time-lapse on steroids. That being said, my favorite description of hyperlapse photography comes from a TV director who was filming me back in 2014 when I was being featured on Belgian national TV about my career as a hyperlapse photography, and he described hyperlapse photography as a flight through time and space. And I like that so much that I've actually been using that in all of my presentations and talks and video courses as well. Now, hyperlapse photography is how I got my first viral video. It's what got me the majority of my online followers, and it even paved the way for me to become a permanent resident in Australia, which then led to me becoming an Australian citizen. Hyperlapse photography is what I put on my business cards, and I've been making hyperlapses since before the word hyperlapse actually existed. As I'm sure you can believe, I can talk about hyperlapse photography for days. Initially, I actually wanted to write a whole separate book about it, but when I remastered the Ultimate Time-Lapse Guide in 2021, I decided to just include it as a separate chapter, which then obviously got turned into this video course and this chapter that you're watching right now. Before delving into the tutorial, let's have a look at what a hyperlapse sequence actually is, where it came from, how it's evolved over time, and then we can talk about how you can create your own in many different ways. Let's go. Today you're learning how to go from this to this. Look at that. I'm going to show you how to use both Apple Motion as well as Adobe After Effects combined to stabilize very complicated, very tricky hyperlapses. Let's begin. Let's have a quick look at what are the issues here. This sequence, straight out of camera, as you can see, is extremely wobbly. Why? Well, I shot it at a medium focal length from a moving boat on the ocean, or in the sea. I don't think it's an ocean over there. That's Mount Vesuvius, the volcano next to Napoli or Naples in Italy. As you can see, straight out of camera, quite the wobble indeed. And usually I would go straight to After Effects and apply the warp stabilizer on it, but this gave me some results that really weren't as good. So I kept trying, and I tried the manual motion tracker, which took me a very long time, and I tried to mask out stuff, all the advanced levels of stabilization. None of them actually worked on this sequence, which I thought was such a shame because it's such a beautiful shot. And then I was like, there's got to be a stabilizer built into Apple Motion, which by the way costs less than 50 bucks as a standalone app. Think about it. I loaded in there, I applied the stabilize effect, and pretty much have my mind blown. I keep trying to nest the sequence and reapply it the way I do it in After Effects, but that doesn't work. So what I did is I applied the stabilize motion effect, and then I applied the warp stabilizer effect on the rendered video that came out of Motion, and what we have is a almost flawless sequence. All that was left to do was deflickering it. So let me run you through how this works. As you can see, we have our sequence here. I color graded these raw files and exported them to the JPEG sequence that you have on screen right now. I create a new project in Motion using the pixels of the photo, so 6000 by 4000 pixels. Make sure the pixels are square, not 1.5, because you'll get a weird aspect ratio. And I also set the project length to the number of frames or the number of photos that I've got. All you're going to do is drag those photos into the timeline and then go to motion tracking and select the stabilize button, then hit analyze. As you can see, it analyzes quite quickly and you end up with a sequence that is pretty good. Now all you're going to do now is export that to a high resolution, high quality codec ProRes file, import that into After Effects, and then apply the warp stabilizer on top of that. Then I created a new composition with that composition to add a deflickering plugin on there, flicker free, and the end result compared to what came out of camera, compared to trying just to use After Effects, compared to the end result is mind-blowing, right? Pretty darn exciting. So yeah, that's it. May your skies be filled with fluffy clouds. Using masks to improve the warp stabilizer's performance. As I've mentioned in previous videos, sometimes the warp stabilizer doesn't do a great job because of certain elements in your frame, such as flags or waves, etc. However, if you have one object, one element in your frame that doesn't move around, probably the object that you've focused on during your hyperlapse shoot, you can actually tell the warp stabilizer to only focus on that object and disregard everything else. And you do that using masks. I don't know a lot of people that use this method, and it is by far one of my favorite ways to correct or to stabilize very tricky hyperlapse sequences. By the way, yes, I realize this is a bit echoey and it looks different from other videos. This is the very first video that I'm recording in our new flat. You can find out more info about that on my YouTube channel or my Instagram stories. Anyways, to the tutorial. Here is the sequence once again straight out of camera. Now imagine that the things on the side here throw off the warp stabilizer. This could be a row of poles and flags like you would find on pedestrian bridges or something like that. What to do with this? First of all, you want to create a new composition in which you were going to create a mask. Right click on your sequence, new comp from selection, double click that to make sure you're in it and just have a look. That is the exact same sequence. Now, how do you create a mask? It is incredibly simple. Make sure that you're somewhere in the timeline where you can easily mask out an object. Go to this pen tool here, and all you need to create a mask is make sure that this sequence is selected in the timeline. Click the pen tool and create yourself a nice little mask just like that. And boom, there you have it. In case it doesn't look like this, you can open up the masks section here and change that setting here to add. This intersects with other masks. For example, if I create a new mask using that add method, this will add the mask on top of that, but we don't use that. We only want to use the one single mask. Now, if we apply the warp stabilizer to this sequence, it won't work, it won't activate. So we have to create another new composition from the composition that we just masked out. Before we do that, let's have a quick verification to see if our subject is in the frame for the whole sequence, and indeed it is. So right click, new comp from selection once again. Now you're going to apply the warp stabilizer, select 10%, and as I'm sure you can imagine, what this is doing now is analyzing the stuff that's moving, and the only stuff that's moving is the stuff that you've masked out. So say on the side of your sequence here, you have all this moving stuff or flags or whatever, if it's waves or trees or plants or whatever it is that's moving, that's throwing off the warp stabilizer, you can use this method to just select a portion of your frame that you know should be rock solid, very stable indeed. Let that run for a bit, it'll stabilize, and then we're removing the mask from that other composition and you'll have a smooth sequence. Stabilization done, let's have a quick look, and as you can see, that whole mask's moving around, but the St. Paul's Cathedral, the dome, seems to be rock solid. Now, how do we remove the mask? You go to the previous composition that you were in, you navigate down to the mask, and you can do two things. You can just delete the mask, or you go to this blend mode and select none. And that removes the mask. It's still there in case you need to make adjustments. But now go back to your other composition, the one you applied the warp stabilizer to, hit Ctrl-0 to render a preview, and voila! A entirely smooth sequence. This is one of my favorite tricks in After Effects, using the warp stabilizer and these masks to create smooth sequences for complicated hyperlapses. There you go. On to the next one. In certain cases, when you've applied a stabilization to a hyperlapse sequence using the stabilize motion method, not the warp stabilizer method, you might end up with a sequence that behaves like this after you've applied the stabilization. This is due to the movement of the shot and it trying to keep the two keyframes in the same position. When your perspective changes as you move through space when you're shooting it, this can lead to this kind of behavior. Now, because this tracker and these tracking points have applied transformations to this sequence already in the form of keyframes across this whole sequence, it's best not to touch those keyframes. So, how do we do this? Right click, new, null object. The null object is something that we can apply transformations to, but there's nothing on the screen. It is null, so it's kind of like an invisible thing that will help us to create movements and keyframes on other objects, such as the sequence underneath. Now, if you do anything to this null object, nothing happens. You can see something move there, but that's not affecting our sequence, right? So what do you want to do? First of all, you want to select this whirly icon. It's called the parent pick whip on the sequence, and you want to drag that on top of the null object, and this binds the two together. So if I now look on the first frame of this sequence, if I now apply the rotation on the null object, it applies that rotation to the sequence underneath as well, because we've linked the two together. Now, how do we fix this sequence from moving? You select the chrono icon on the first frame on the rotation parameter, which creates a keyframe. Then you go to the last frame and you apply a transformation to the rotation, and you try and get it as straight as possible. Now, if you've got a keen eye, you've noticed an issue here. and we'll solve that issue in a second. But just by moving this parameter, you see that it's created a new keyframe, so you don't have to manually create a keyframe and then adjust your parameter there. So just kind of get that straight as possible. Now, as you can see, this footage is cut off here, and you can fix that by selecting this little thing here, which has something to do with collapse transformations for composited layers. It's pretty complicated, but if you just click there, boom, the sequence fills up with what is visible in the other composition. So just make sure your keyframes, beginning and end, are kind of straight, kind of straightened out, something like that. You can adjust the scale a bit as well if your footage isn't filling the screen completely. And now you just hit Ctrl-0 and have a preview, and bada bing, bada boom. That is a pretty smooth sequence that we've just straightened out using a null object. The null object is incredibly useful for these kinds of things, and you'll be using them more and more when you go into very complicated hyperlapse moves. The world's your oyster with these kinds of things. After Effects is such a powerful software package, and yeah, the more you use it, the more familiar you get, and the more you will realize what else you can do, etc. as well. Anyways, this was a quick look at how you can use null objects for transformations. Something that happens quite a lot with very complicated hyperlapse moves where you're moving around buildings, etc., is that your tracking points disappear. So the software doesn't have anything to track anymore because it moves out of frame, or it gets obscured by a pole, or like by a house rooftop or whatever. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use multiple trackers on the same footage to still do an initial stabilization of the footage, and then you can apply the warp stabilizer on top of that to get a smooth result. Let's have a look at the sequence that we have been working on, and I've tracked it halfway. I've made the sequence 2 seconds in length to make it easier for the tutorial. We've applied the first motion tracker with the stabilize motion button that we saw in the previous video. And let's just imagine that this second tracker point here on the left disappears for some reason in the second half of this clip. How do you continue stabilizing this footage with that tracker point disappearing? Well, it's pretty straightforward, really. Make sure you are selected on this sequence in the composition, and then just hit the stabilize motion button again. You're going to zoom in on the clip, make sure that rotation is active as well, and you're just going to repeat the process that we did earlier. However, your second tracking point, because the initial one disappeared, we are now going to place on another part of the image that is in the shot for the remainder of the clip. Now you can just hit play, and as you can see, it's analyzing quite well. I'm just going to assume that the first tracking point is analyzing similarly. These keyframes have been generated, and now if we apply those transformations, you will see that those two tracking points do a really good job at keeping this steady. Even though I have moved from tracker 1 to tracker 2 here with that little overlap, I have a nearly flawless sequence. If I now create a new composition from that selection and apply the warp stabilizer again at 10% or less, depending on how smooth your footage is, you can get some really, really smooth shots. Now, in some cases, when you're using the stabilize motion method, the level kind of goes off. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to use a null object to further transform your footage to make sure that it is all nice, smooth, and level throughout the entire sequence. The stabilize motion method is the second way of stabilizing hyperlapse footage in Adobe's After Effects software, and this method is incredibly useful for shots where the warp stabilizer isn't doing a good job. Keep in mind, the warp stabilizer is an algorithm that looks at the entire footage, finds all these tracking points, and then does the same thing and tries to track them frame by frame, all these points. In some cases, for example, grass or waves if you're on the foreshore, or waving flags on a bridge, these are all shots I've had issues with in the past, and they really confuse the warp stabilizer. As good as it has gotten over the years, some shots will not work. We'll talk about how you can edit those in different ways as well in the advanced hyperlapse editing chapters, but for now, let's have a look at the stabilize motion method, which will get you on the way to a smooth shot for a challenging shot. So, just like in the previous video, initially you want to separate your JPEG photos from your RAW photos. Once again, they'll have the same file name, just a different extension, the exact same aspect ratio and pixels, etc. You're going to import that JPEG sequence into After Effects, just like before, import JPEG sequence, create composition is activated, and that gives us this. We know what it looks like straight out of camera. It's not a great look. As per usual, let's make sure that our file names are consistent, so let's go with that. And yeah, straight out of camera, this is a jittery shot. Now say this didn't work for the warp stabilizer. What can we do instead? Go into the tracker panel. If it's not visible, you can go to Window, Workspace, All Panels, and this will show the tracker panel on the right here. Click on that, and instead of clicking Warp Stabilizer here, you want to click on the Stabilize Motion button. This opens up the sequence in your composition in this layer viewer here, and it has these two squares with a little cross in the middle as track point 1. You will notice that at the right here, it says current track, tracker 1. We'll be able to apply more trackers in future videos, but for now, let's just focus on this. Your track type is stabilize, and you're going to also enable rotation. Now to stabilize rotation, you need more than 1 point, so it generates a second track point. The way these track points work is the inner square is the set of pixels that the software will look for in each frame. And I suggest putting that over your anchor point or your element on your subject that you used as the fixed element for each photo in your sequence. That is the inner frame, that's that set of pixels. The outer frame is the area, is the region in which the software is going to look for that set of pixels. So if I go to the next frame, as long as my element is contained within that larger frame, it will be able to find that set of pixels. So the larger you create these squares, the longer it will take the software to stabilize, which makes sense because it has to look for more pixels, right? So step 1, find your tracking point that you use to shoot, and then find something acceptable that goes around it. The cleaner you shot your sequence, the less wobble you shot your sequence with, obviously the smaller you can make these frames. Now, let's find a second tracking point. I'm just going to go with that and drag it somewhere else. And I've prepped this already as per usual. This is a nice contrasty point for the tracker to find. So you can actually make that quite small. And I know that if I go over it frame by frame, it will stay in the right spot. Now, what's the next step? Depending on how well you shot it, you can either hit this play button and it will start analyzing the sequence forward. And I highly recommend you keep an eye out on this sequence because already, as you can see, this square is no longer where we put it at the start. So using the up and down arrows, not the left, right, up and down arrows that you find on your keyboard. I actually don't know what they're called, but don't use these keys because they change the position of your sequence in your composition. You don't want that. You want to use these keys if you have them. Or you can just use the playhead on the timeline. Now, look at how on this frame here, that cross point, that anchor point of that tracker point 2 is on the corner, but on the next frame, it went wrong. So I'm dragging that back to where I know it was supposed to track. And to prevent it from going crazy and going kind of out of bounds and you have to like keep an eye on 2 tracking points, you can go frame by frame by clicking Analyze 1 frame forward. And again, it's gone wrong here. So again, I'm clicking Analyze 1 frame forward. And I think from here on, it does a pretty good job. This takes time, but that's how you make great stuff. Rome wasn't built in a day. Amazing hyperlapse sequences are not plug and play, are not easy to process most of the time. Effort goes in, but the results will be worth it. So let's hit the play button again, see how it moves across the sequence. I know the one on the right is pretty... Oh, I hit stop here because that went wrong. I'm using those arrows again to go back to see where it went wrong, and maybe before that. Yeah, before that as well. So you really want to check each frame to get it as right as possible. That doesn't look right, so boop. You can zoom in with Command plus. Next frame, next frame, next frame, and just manually adjust it where it goes wrong. Boom. Next frame. Zoom out again, make sure the other one's still in control, and do this for the whole sequence. And the next one seems to be all right. Now what I might do is make this, whoops, Now what I might do is make this frame smaller because I think it's looking in too many areas for those pixels. So let's go one frame forward and let's complete this track that doesn't look right. Back on that point, one frame forward. What we're doing here is analyzing the position of these pixels so that we can apply a reverse transformation to the entire frame based on these pixels. We're pretty much telling the software where the pixels have gone, and then we're going to apply that to the entire sequence so those pixels stay in the same spot, and ideally the rest of your sequence also stays in the same spot. Now, I rarely just use this to stabilize. I will start, for very tricky shots, I will start with this motion tracker style approach to stabilize, and then I will make a new composition of what I've just created, of what I've just analyzed, and then apply the warp stabilizer on that. And that is how you can stabilize some really complicated shots. And take your time for this. The more you take your time, the more in-depth you look at this, the better the results will end up being. But that's all looking all right. So let me just go through with this, and I'll see you at the finish line. Now we've fully analyzed and we've manually adjusted the track of these two tracking points. You hit the apply button and you'll see apply dimensions X and Y, or you can choose just the X axis or the Y axis. In certain situations you might want to do that, but here we'll do X and Y, hit OK, and now it's going to grab all these movements that the pixels have done, that the two tracking points have done, and apply the reverse movement of that on the sequence, and you will see it's not going to be perfect, but you will see the frame move around. If you look at the edges of the frames here, you can see where it actually moves all the pixels around in the composition, and that's how you end up with some of these black stripes or bars at the end, because that's the edge of the photo, and it's moving the entire photo around to make sure that this is nice and smooth. And as you can see, something went wrong there, and I'll show you how to fix that in a second. This is definitely the much more time-consuming option, but it allows you to create some really cool sequences, and we'll talk about multiple tracking points in a future video as well. Now, what I recommend you do here is either you increase the scale of the footage because of these black bars on the edge, or you decrease the size of the composition. I'll show you how to do that in a bit, but first let's finalize this stabilization. And just like that, that's what that run of manually stabilizing it has done. Now, as you can see, it is not perfect. There's a couple of jitters there. If you want to fix some of those jitters, you navigate to where the jitter is, because that means you probably, like here, there's a little rotation here. Go to that point, double click on the sequence in your timeline, and it will open up that tracker again. And now, if you see here, you can tell that I actually missed this. I have to drag that just more to that corner. Now I can hit apply again, and it will just apply that to that sequence again. And that should take care of some of that extra jitter. Now, obviously, don't finish it here. What I would recommend you do here is hit new comp from selection, and then you apply the warp stabilizer to that. 10%, let that run, and this will give you an enormously smooth sequence for sequences where it is very tricky to use the warp stabilizer at first because of distracting elements in the frame like water or trees, leaves, grass, flags, whatever it is. Now, as I mentioned, some of these frames have the footage moving across and creating these dark stripes because that's the end of the photo, right? So there's two ways you can fix that. In the timeline, with that sequence selected, hit the S button, S for scale, and increase the scale up until the point where the edges are gone, or you can go the other way around and actually adjust the size of the composition that the sequence is in. If you go right click on that, composition settings, you can decrease that by a few pixels, say 50 pixels, shift an arrow down, and now you will see that the scale is at 100%, so in theory it should fill the frame, but the composition has shrunk in size, which explains why the edges of the photo are now outside of the edge of the composition. But as you can see, that wasn't enough for that frame. So let's shrink the size of the composition by, say, 200 pixels in total. And now you'll see that that has expanded the photo in the composition even more, or actually it's shrunk the composition, and you are now done with these black bars or these black edges on the side of the frame. And that's it for the stabilize motion method, which I most often use in conjunction with the warp stabilizer, as you saw. Now there are more ways to stabilize, and there are more advanced techniques to stabilize as well. So let's have a look at those. As mentioned, there are multiple ways to stabilize your hyperlapse sequences. In this video, I'm covering the warp stabilizer method. The warp stabilizer, as you may know by now, is a built-in effect. It's a stabilization algorithm in Adobe After Effects. Now, let's go into Lightroom Classic first to have a look at our sequence. Then we'll move into After Effects. So here we have our first sequence in Lightroom. I've already separated it from the offload folder. As you can see here on the left, I've named it St. Paul's Hyper 01-RAW. It's 84 photos. I will give you these JPEGs to download to play with as well in the download section underneath this video. Now there's a thing you got to do before you move to After Effects, which is obviously making sure that this folder contains nothing but the actual hyperlapse sequence, so none of these dark frames that we shot, which, by the way, look something like that. Quite easy to visualize where that starts and ends the sequence. But let's go into Finder or Explorer if you're on a PC, and let's separate the JPEGs from the RAWs. This isn't entirely necessary, but I do that because it just makes archival and reprocessing footage a little bit easier for the future. So what I would do here is just copy that name. I go in that folder, I select just the JPEGs. As you can see, I've separated them here by kind. I select just the JPEGs, and then I've created a folder for them. So now I've got a folder with the same name and actually also the same file names in there, just a different extension. If you look at that first photo, pls53911.jpg, the raw file is pls53911.rw2. You now are going to import this JPEG sequence into After Effects, and as we've covered before, there are multiple ways to import. You can go to Import and File, you can double click here in the project window, or you can just grab your folder with the JPEGs and drag that in there. Let's quickly go to File and Import, because there's something I want to point out here. If you're going to import a sequence, be it a time-lapse or a hyperlapse, you want it to be sequential. You want all these numbers to count up, so 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, etc. Should that not be the case, you can click this Force Alphabetical Order button, and that will actually force, what a surprise, the alphabetical order. The most important thing to click here, though, is this Importer JPEG sequence, Importer JPEG sequence. I don't know why that is this spelling here, but you're going to select the first photo of the sequence, and then you are going to click Open. And as you can see, because I also had selected Create Composition, this sequence that's just been imported here has already been turned into a composition. This composition has the same aspect ratio and pixels and frame rate as well as this imported sequence, which is pretty useful because we'll be working on that in the master resolution. What I would do here now is rename that to JPEG, and same for that composition. And let's drag that open a bit so you can keep following along. And now it's actually really simple. So this composition already exists. If you hit Control and 0, it will show you a quick preview of what it looks like. And as I mentioned in one of the previous videos, no matter how accurately you shoot it, I've been doing this for close to 10 years now, it will still look quite jittery. Now, the only thing you got to do is go to the tracker panel here, or go to the Effects and Presets panel and look up Warp Stabilizer, and then you just drag that onto the sequence in your composition. It's going to automatically start analyzing this footage, but what I want you to do is go in the top left and under the smoothness parameter, change that from 50 to 10%. The 50 is overkill. If you shot it properly, if your subject is a good hyperlapse subject, you will notice that you can get away with only 10% to start with. If this isn't enough, you can create a new composition from the composition that you've just stabilized. You just create a new composition from that, and then you apply that warp stabilizer again, once again changing it to 10%. Now, instead of wasting time for this tutorial, I've already prepped this. Once that analyzation is done, this is the result you will get from one single run of stabilizing. As you can see, quite an enormous difference from the straight out of camera sequence, which is what you're looking at right now. And then we compare that to a single run of stabilizing with the warp stabilizer, and that is just amazing, right? Now, should it still be a bit wobbly or shaky, what you can do with that sequence that you've just applied the warp stabilizer to, you right click it and you create a new composition from the selection. The reason you have to do it that way is because you cannot apply the warp stabilizer twice to the same composition. You have to create a new composition from the one you were working on. So when you do that, you just apply the warp stabilizer again, change that to 10% again, and it'll reanalyze and create an even smoother result. Should this not work for your sequence or not work well enough for your sequence, there are many other ways that we can stabilize, and there are many more videos in this chapter, so don't worry about that. I'm sure we will cover it all. Now, to export this, we will export this not like any other time-lapse sequences, because remember, we're working with the JPEG files for now. What you want to do here is go back to Lightroom and add a color grade to your sequence, which we'll do really quickly. I'm using the built-in presets that come with this course as well, so set exposure manually. Let's change the treatment to camera landscape. Let's go sunny, low contrast for this, emphasize colors, blah blah blah, lens corrections, and let's add a certain look to it. Up the shadows, drop the highlights, and then we are just going to synchronize that across the sequence. So with Shift, I'm clicking the last photo. With that first one selected, right click, develop settings, sync settings, synchronize all these settings, bada bing, bada boom. It's now pasting the settings across the whole sequence. Once that synchronization is done, you're going to right click anywhere in the sequence, you're going to go to metadata, and now you're saving metadata to files. This should be pretty familiar for you. It's saving the metadata, and now let's go back to Explorer or Finder. And now this is where the fun begins. As you can see, these raw files now have accompanying XMP files, which of course carry all that editing data that we've just applied to it. And now we're going to replace that JPEG sequence that we imported from the start. So this is that JPEG sequence. If you go right click on it and go replace footage with file, because it has the same file name but a different extension, but mostly because it has the same file name and it's pretty much the same file, you can literally just replace that like so. Camera raw sequence, it's going to import now. Hit open, and it will retain the stabilization on top of the sequence, because all we've done is in the back end replaced the JPEGs with the raw files, but it will retain all the transformations that the stabilizer has done to this sequence. And now all that's left is to export that sequence. You can go File, Export, Add to Render Queue, or Control Command M. Choose your preferred codec. I'm obviously a QuickTime ProRes 422 HQ or 422. Man, select your destination where you want to export it, hit render, and let it run. And before you know it, you've got yourself a raw sequence that you've color graded and stabilized using the JPEGs to speed up your workflow. So this is the approach of how I edit the majority of my hyperlapse sequences. Now, some sequences don't work that well, so let's move on to the second method of stabilizing, and then we will look into some more in-depth tips and tricks to do some advanced stabilization methods. Let's have a quick look at how the hyperlapse stabilization process works. There are two ways that we can stabilize hyperlapse sequences, and they both rely on Adobe's After Effects software. The concept is the same. The software will track motion and then reverse that motion to make sure that it is as smooth as possible. The first method we will rely on mostly. For the majority of my shots, I use the warp stabilizer effect, which is a built-in algorithm which is pretty much magic. It has come an incredibly long way from when it was first introduced in After Effects, around when I started hyperlapsing back in 2012 or even earlier. And it is pretty much magic. The algorithm has advanced so much by now that it really has drastically cut short the average post-production time for hyperlapse productions. Now, what this does is it tracks pixels and it keeps them in the same spot, but not only that, it can fill in gaps on your frame for when it's reframing. It can actually warp the sequence as well in case there is some perspective warp, etc. For 95% of the shots, you'll be using the warp stabilizer, possibly a number of times on the same sequence, and that will just do the trick. For more tricky shots, there is a second method. This is the stabilize motion method, which is an effect that you will find in the same tab in After Effects, and this relies on tracking a select group of pixels or two groups of pixels throughout each frame. You tell the software which pixels to track. Throughout the sequence, it records where these pixels move, and then it applies the opposite transformation of these pixels moving on the X and the Y axis. It applies the opposite of that movement to the entire frame so that these pixels in theory stay in the exact same position. You can do this, as I said, on the X and the Y axis, so you can actually apply this for both position, rotation, and scale of your footage. This second method is something you use for more advanced shots where the warp stabilizer might get confused by certain elements in your frame, etc. I'll be covering both of these methods, obviously, and some more as well in other software applications, but I thought I would give you an overview of how this works. Now, the reason that we shot RAW as well as JPEG sequences at the same time while we were producing the hyperlapse content is because RAW photos, or RAW files actually, because they're not really photos, they're a collection of raw data, are incredibly slow and cumbersome to work with. So instead of working with the RAW files, we'll be working with the JPEG files as a sort of proxy file, as a placeholder, which is why it's important that they have the exact same number of pixels in them. JPEGs are more compressed, they're much more easy to read by the software, and they're much more easy to stabilize. Once your stabilization is done on the JPEG sequence, before exporting them to the master file, you will simply replace the JPEG sequence with your newly color graded RAW sequence and then export it. This is by far the most efficient way to both color grade and stabilize a RAW hyperlapse sequence, and I'm going to teach you how to do it, and it's probably going to blow your mind at how easy this all is and how powerful this type of footage is to really wow your viewer. So let's begin. Alrighty, you've made it to the exciting part of this chapter, how to actually shoot a hyperlapse in the manual handheld way, just the way I do it. Now, the concept is very simple. You're going to find an object to shoot. You're going to find a path sideways or towards or around that object to shoot from. You're going to get in the zone and you're going to start clicking away. Now, the reality is slightly more complicated, but incredibly simple to understand and to perform once you know what you're looking for. So let's break it down in steps. First of all, you want to find a subject to shoot. Find yourself a building with a clear path in front of it where no foot traffic or vehicular traffic will get in your way. Doesn't have to be a building, can be a landscape as well, but buildings are more easy to start with. Then you're going to want to find a path to follow for your hyperlapse. This can be a set of tiles or the sidewalk or a chalk line that you draw yourself. Whatever it is, it should be quite easy to do the exact same distance in between steps. I often don't follow tiles or chalk marks or anything. I just get in the zone, as I mentioned earlier, and I kind of remember how big each footstep is that I'm performing. Practice makes perfect. This is another one of those where the more you do it, the easier it becomes. But yes, that is step 2. Find yourself a track that you will follow. Then you're going to want to find an element on your subject that will be in frame for the entire sequence. Often I use doors or windows or even rooftop tips. The only important thing here is that this object is in frame for the entire sequence. Then you're going to want to set up your camera just as you would for a basic time-lapse. So everything to manual, white balance, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, etc. And then the most crucial thing, this will make your life in post-production so much easier. Make sure that you're shooting both RAW and JPEG photos in the exact same resolution. I'll explain why later. If you have lens stabilization or sensor stabilization available on your system, I recommend turning it on because you're shooting handheld. This will make your life just a little bit easier. If you have grid view available on your camera, I recommend turning that on to help you with balancing it or leveling the camera. And of course, if you have an electronic leveling gauge, you can turn that on as well to help you to make sure that all your photos are leveled. Then, before you begin your sequence, we're going to do a test sequence. You're going to look at your path, and instead of shooting a photo every little step, start at the start, click a photo, then take 5 or 10 steps, click the next photo, and keep that element in the exact same position. You can use one of the grid intersections for this, or you can use a focus point on your camera, or on the Lumix cameras, for example, you can actually set up a custom point that you want to keep in the same spot for every photo. The point of this sequence here, where you take 5 or 10 steps in between, is to get a preview. When you scroll through the sequence from beginning to end, you can tell whether you need to adjust the element, your anchor point on your subject, because maybe it moves out of frame, or maybe when you get closer to the building, it becomes too high or too low. So you're doing a test run before you commit to the full sequence. Then you're going to want to go back to the sequence, go back to the starting point, and get ready to shoot your first hyperlapse. What I often do here is shoot a couple of dark frames by just holding my hand in front of the lens, which will make it easier to recognize the beginning and the start of the sequence later on using the thumbnails in Lightroom Classic. Then take a deep breath, line up your frame with the element on your subject, take your first photo, take a step, and take your second photo. The concept here is to get in the zone. Stay comfortable, stay breathing, make sure that you're shooting as accurately as possible, meaning both your distance and your timing has to be about the same for every photo. You're better off taking it a little bit slow than being too rushed. Just find your flow, get in the zone, and repeat. And before you know it, you're cruising through the sequence. Again, take your time with this. The idea is to show the passing of time. If you're running as fast as you can, you won't have a lot of time that's passed, so your sequence won't be as effective. Depending on your location, it can get incredibly hectic with people traveling through your shot or getting in your way or whatever. So it often really helps to have a friend or a family member to help you with spotting. I shot one of my first big sequences in Italy of the Duomo and through the gallery in Milano with my mom as my spotter. It's one of my most fun memories of my career as a time-lapse photographer, and that was really fun. She would help get groups of people out of the way because obviously that is such a touristy scene. Repeat this shoot, step, shoot process for at least 100 photos, ideally much more if you can handle it. Keep shooting until your sequence is done, until you can shoot no more. Lower your camera and enjoy blood rushing back in your arms and your shoulders. You're likely to be very cramped up and in quite a bit of pain. I have done this so many times, and it is one of the nicest feelings to literally just drop the camera at the end of a sequence. Wipe the sweat off your face, wipe the sweat off your camera, and have a look at your sequence. Hit the play button, scroll through it, and see what it looks like straight out of camera. The more you do this, the easier it will become to find proper subjects, proper pathways, and proper lines to follow to shoot these kinds of shots. Now, the fun bit begins. We're going to jump into some software to stabilize the sequence and create something really cool. What do you need to shoot a hyperlapse? As I mentioned earlier, a hyperlapse is just like a time-lapse. You just shoot a sequence of photos. Now, you don't actually need any special equipment for a hyperlapse sequence. In fact, you can get away with much less. The vast majority of my hyperlapses are shot without a tripod, without a remote, just me handheld, clicking away, making my way to or towards the side of a building. Now, the reason I don't use a tripod is because I am the tripod. My eye height never deviates, right? That is all the same height, you get what I mean? The other reason is because I don't have to move a tripod and then level the ball head or the three-way photo head, I can shoot much faster and create many more sequences to play with in post. The only downside in this way of shooting, of course, is that you can't use ND filters to drag your shutter or increase your shutter speed, but we'll cover that in a future video. And the reason I don't use a intervalometer or a remote is because when you're shooting with a remote, you are stuck to that frequency. I believe it is much better to get in the zone and to click away as consistently as you can, because every now and then you will come across something in your sequence, on your travel, on your hyperlapse that delays you, and then you will end up with a shot that doesn't fit into the sequence. Keep in mind that the majority of these clips will be playing back at 25 to 30 frames per second, and if one of those frames is out by only a couple of seconds, the majority of the people will never notice that. So you can actually get away with quite a lot when shooting handheld hyperlapses. One crucial tip that I give to all of my hyperlapse students is to never shoot wider than 24mm focal length on a full frame equivalent. The reason for that is if you are shooting extremely wide angle, for example 16mm, the distortion you get on the edges of the frame by even the slightest deviation of lining up your shot results in quite a lot of a perspective shift or a distortion purely because of the optics of the lens. The way these stabilization algorithms will work in post-production is they find it incredibly difficult to straighten that out. For that reason, go 24mm or higher. Ideally, something like 30 or 35mm is a really nice sweet spot for hyperlapses where you won't have any of that weird wobble in post-production. Now, for more complicated hyperlapses, for example, where you're going from day to night, a holy grail, or when you want to drag your shutter using ND filters, obviously you're going to need to shoot on a tripod, which takes more time because you gotta lift your stuff and adjust your ball head. Couple of really useful things that you can use there is a 3-way geared ball head, which allows you to minutely and very accurately adjust your 3 axes of movement of your camera. And I also highly recommend, and I see very few people use this, to get some wheels for your tripod. This was an absolute game changer for me when I started using those in 2014 at festivals, in big stadiums, etc. It really sped up my workflow by quite a bit, and they're pretty affordable online. So if you're thinking of doing some advanced hyperlapses, check out these extra products that will make your life so much easier. Then of course you can also shoot hyperlapses on a gimbal, but we will cover that in future videos. For now, let's get cracking. Let's have a look at how to shoot a handheld hyperlapse. What is a hyperlapse? Guy Roland, a filmmaker based in Montreal, Canada, released a short experimental abstract time-lapse film called Pacer in 1995. Pacer is widely regarded as being the first example of a dedicated hyperlapse short film. Incredulously, Guy shot this short film on an analog Bolex 16mm film camera. He used a special body mount for it, and it took an enormous amount of time to get it made. Now, sadly, these original negatives, the original film roll, has vanished over time. But luckily, Guy has actually remastered one of his old files and gave us a re-release of the short film Pacer in the year 2015. I've linked it below this video if you want to go have a look. I highly recommend it because it is just incredible to see someone do this back in the 90s. Now, hyperlapse photography became incredibly popular in 2012 and 2013 when Russian filmmaker and photographer Artem Serevich started sharing some of his incredibly groundbreaking, innovative work on his Vimeo page under the username Zweizwei. I dare say, and this is based on nothing but my gut feeling, I think that Guy Roland actually remastered his Pacer short film in 2015 because of the popularity of Zweizwei's uploads. Again, this is pure speculation on my part, but who could blame him? I know that I would have done the exact same thing. Compared to a normal time-lapse where the camera is mounted on a tripod or on a motion control system in the exact same position, a hyperlapse physically moves the camera in between each frames. This distance can be a couple of centimeters or inches or feet or more. The only prerequisite is that this distance remains the same between photos. A hyperlapse photographer needs to pay an incredible amount of attention to detail when shooting because you want to get each frame as close to the previous frame as far as composition and lining up of your shot goes. Now, just like a normal time-lapse, you shoot a large series of photos at a fixed interval and then you turn them into a master video file. Now, there is an extra step in the post-production for a hyperlapse sequence, and that is, of course, stabilization, because no matter how accurate your framing and composition is for each of these photos, there's no way that you can actually get them fully smooth in camera, so we will be using stabilization algorithms in post to fully smooth this out. An unstabilized hyperlapse sequence completely rips the viewer out of this cinematic illusion of time warping, and it's just an incredibly jarring and jittery result, so we really have to focus on this stabilization process. Now, over the years, this stabilization process has increased in efficiency quite dramatically. It used to be the case that for one day of shooting, I would spend multiple days trying to stabilize all this footage. With improvements in algorithms and stabilization software in a range of applications, this has now been brought down massively. One day of shooting, I can probably get away with about half a day to 1 day of editing. There's no denying that hyperlapse photography has increased in popularity over the years. There's an app by Instagram called Hyperlapse. Microsoft has a research division for hyperlapse. You can create time warp videos using the latest GoPros, using their hypersmooth features, etc. If you're only getting into hyperlapse photography right now, it is a very exciting time to enter because it literally has never been easier to create this sort of captivating content. Now let's have a look at how we actually do this stuff.